3 months after Lynette Hooker disappeared during a sailing trip with her husband, Brian Hooker, it appears Coast Guard investigators are disputing his account of what transpired.
You want to keep looking for Lynette?
I'm going to need somebody with more authority to tell me to stop.
He tells his wife's friend in a text message that she swam toward the sailboat. He tells investigators she was swept away by the current and never made it back at all. 2 different stories from the same man about the same night. And somewhere between those 2 versions is a 55-year-old woman who has never been seen again. Before we go further, I need to say something. Stories like this only get told because people like you keep watching, keep sharing, keep pushing them into the light. Families like Lynette Hooker's are still waiting for answers. And every subscriber, every notification turn on, is one more person paying attention when it matters. So if this channel means something to you, hit subscribe, tap that bell, and stay with us. Because today, we're going inside the mind of a man whose story keeps changing and the woman who trusted him with her life. Let's start with who Lynette actually was. Because in stories like this, she so easily becomes a footnote in her husband's narrative. She shouldn't be. Lynette Hooker was 55, from a small town called Unsolved, Michigan. By every account, she loved the water. Not casually, deeply. She and her husband Brian had spent years building a life around sailing, buying a 1980 Morgan 461, and restoring it themselves before setting off to actually live on it. They called themselves the Sailing Hookers online, and if you looked at their pages, you'd see a couple who looked like they'd figured out how to escape the ordinary. Smiling photos, snorkeling trips, sunsets in the Gulf, in Key West, in the Bahamas. But here's something worth sitting with psychologically. The people closest to Lynette say the public version of her marriage and the private one were not the same thing. Her daughter, Carly Aylesworth, has said her mother confided in her about fear, about threats. She's alleged that during a fight in 2024, Brian threatened to throw Lynette overboard, the same body of water that would later swallow her. A neighbor has said Lynette told her mother she was in an abusive situation. And in 2015, Michigan police were called to home after a domestic dispute, where both Brian and Lynette accused each other of assault. Nobody was charged. The prosecutor said there wasn't enough evidence to say who started it. I want to be really clear here, because this is important. None of these things prove what happened on that boat in April. But in psychology, when we study patterns of coercive control and intimate partner violence, one thing shows up again and again. The private reality of a relationship and the public performance of it can be 2 completely different worlds. The couple posting matching smiles from a sailboat and the woman quietly telling her daughter she's scared are not mutually exclusive. That contradiction alone is worth remembering as we go through what happened next. So let's go to the night itself. April 4th, 2026. Around 7:30 in the evening, Brian and Lynette get into their small 8-foot dinghy near Hopetown in the Bahamas, heading back to their yacht, Soulmate, anchored off Elbow Cay. Brian's story is this. The weather turned rough. Lynette fell overboard. She had the ignition key with her, so when she went into the water, the engine died with her. He says the current pulled her away almost instantly, and he lost sight of her in the dark. Unable to restart the boat, he says he paddled for hours until the dinghy finally drifted into Marsh Harbor, where he got help around 4 in the morning. That's the account. And for a moment, just sit in it the way investigators had to. A man, alone, in the dark, watching his wife of 25 years disappear into open water, with no way to reach her. It's a devastating story. It's also, so far, the only story we have, because Lynette has never been found. What happened over the following months is where psychology gets complicated, because it's not really about one big lie. It's about small inconsistencies that accumulate, one after another, until the whole account starts to feel unstable. The first one came from a friend of the couple, a man named Daniel Danforth. He revealed that Soulmate had a $33,000 thermal imaging camera on board, a system capable of seeing heat signatures in total darkness, even tracking movement to and from the boat. Danforth said he brought this up to the Coast Guard in May, and that it was the first time they'd heard the camera existed. Think about that for a second. A man searching desperately for his missing wife, with a piece of equipment on his own boat built specifically to find a person in the dark, and by every account available, he never used it. Now, On its own, that could be explained by panic, by shock, by someone simply not thinking clearly in a crisis. Human behavior under extreme stress is not always logical, and we have to be careful not to read guilt into every gap. But it's the kind of detail that makes investigators start asking harder questions. And they did in May. The U.S. Coast Guard seized Soulmate and opened a formal criminal investigation. They pulled data from Brian's electronic devices. And according to multiple sources, that data did not match the timeline and locations he had described. This is the moment the story shifts from tragedy to something investigators are now treating very differently. Because in June, the Coast Guard sent a team back into the Sea of Abaco, divers, underwater drones, a cadaver dog, searching what they called newly identified areas of interest, areas, it seems, pointed to by that very device data. They also brought the dinghy back to the United States for forensic testing. The search ended June 8th. Still no sign of Lynette. Around this same time, a U.S. official told reporters a case was being investigated as a possible foreign murder of an American citizen, a word the Coast Guard has since publicly pushed back on. Even while confirming the criminal investigation remains active, I want to pause on the psychology of inconsistency here, because it matters. When someone tells the truth about a traumatic event, the story tends to stay structurally the same over time, even if small details shift. When someone is constructing a narrative, the core facts, locations, timing, sequence of events are often the parts that quietly move. That's not a diagnosis of guilt. It's simply what behavioral analysts look for. And in this case, the location data reportedly not matching the account is exactly that kind of structural inconsistency. Now here's the twist that reframed everything for the people who love Lynette the most. In July, her mother, Darlene Hamlet, went public with something she said she'd been holding back. She told reporters, quote, "She made it back to the boat, and there was foul play. Not the dinghy, not the open water. The boat, Soulmate itself." She didn't explain how she reached that conclusion. She said only that investigators had asked her to limit what she says publicly, which itself tells her the investigation has moved somewhere specific enough that a grieving mother has been coached on what not to reveal. Think about what that claim does to the entire narrative. If Lynette made it back to the boat that night, then the version of the story involving a current, a lost ignition key, hours of paddling in the dark, none of that would be the ending of her story. It would be a version constructed after the fact. Her stepfather, Bill Hamlet, went even further, suggesting the search area in the Bahamas may have functioned as a diversion, steering attention away from where the truth actually is. This is where we have to be disciplined, because it would be easy to treat this as confirmation of the worst possibility. It isn't. It's a claim from a family member, one who has not detailed her evidence publicly, in a case where no charges have been filed and no body has been recovered. But psychologically, it does something powerful. It transforms the story from a mystery about the sea into a mystery about a marriage, about what actually happened inside that relationship, behind the smiling photos and the matching hashtags. And that brings us back to Brian himself, and a detail that surfaced from decades earlier. In 1999, his first wife, Elizabeth Hoseth, filed for a protective order after their divorce. In the filing, she wrote that during their final interaction, he threatened her with, in her words, an accident. She described years of abuse during the marriage. Brian has not addressed those specific allegations in the reporting available. But if you're someone who studies patterns of behavior across relationships, a claim like that, made decades before Lynette ever went missing, is exactly the kind of thing that reframes everything that follows it, not as proof, but as context that can't be unheard. So here's where the case stands. Lynette Hooker disappeared on April 4th, 2026. She has never been found. Brian Hooker was arrested, questioned for 5 days, and released without charges. He has denied wrongdoing through his attorney. Consistently, the Coast Guard's investigation remains open, with forensic evidence, phone data, and physical evidence from the boat currently under analysis. And a mother who has publicly said she believes her daughter made it back to that boat alive, only for something to happen after that. None of this is settled. There is no conviction. There is no confession. There is a grieving family, a man who maintains his innocence, and an investigation still trying to reconcile a story with the evidence behind it. So I want to ask you something, because this is where you come in. When someone tells a story about the worst night of their life, and that story keeps shifting under pressure, what does that tell us psychologically, panic or construction? Does an unused thermal camera on a boat built to find people in the dark feel like an oversight to you or a choice? And if Lynette really did make it back to that boat, what does that change about everything we think we understand that night? Tell me your theory in the comments. I read every single one. And if this kind of deep human psychological breakdown of real cases is something you want more of, subscribe to Psychology of Crime and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this case could come at any moment, and I don't want you to miss it.